and a little bit of history in the other hand. And I want to start off more than 150 years ago up in the Pacific Northwest. You will likely recognize famous attributed to Chief Sielt, a revered leader of the Duwamish and Suquamish tribes in Puget Sound. They were allegedly spoken to the governor of the Washington Territory in the mid-1850s at the site of present-day Seattle. Every part of this country is sacred to my people, he says, hallowed by some memory. And when the last indigenous person shall have perished from the earth, their memory among white folks have become a myth. These shores will swarm with the invisible dead of my tribe. And when your children's children shall think themselves alone in the field, the store, the shop, in the silence, they will not be alone. At night, when the streets of your cities and villages are quiet and you think deserted, they will throng with those who once filled and still love this beautiful land. White folks will never be alone. Not only do these lines speak of the land as haunted, this now renowned testimony has haunted the consciousness of settlers ever since, which is why so many of us have heard of them in one way or another. But these words were likely not the words of Chief Sielt, but rather were written by this man, Henry Smith, in an 1887 local newspaper article, claiming to be his notes on the famous speech 3 decades earlier. Historians now believe that these words were probably the interpolation, perhaps even the partial invention of Henry Smith. But if that's the case, really they're just as revelatory, aren't they? Because this discourse would then directly reveal a haunted settler consciousness, which is being projected back upon a noble Indian. Henry Smith published this piece at a fraught historical moment, just prior to the last Indian War and the so-called closing of the American frontier, to use Frederick Jackson Turner's imperialist phrase. Not to mention the very same year that Henry Smith sold thousands of acres of land to the newly arrived railroad, land that he had claimed back in the 1850s, thus becoming very wealthy. You see, Americans, white Americans in particular, we have a fascination with haunted houses, which become a ubiquitous form of spooky entertainment during Halloween. Whatever the problem, Chief Sielt, quote, it speaks to our condition, as Quakers say. The fact is, our American histories, places, and psyches are haunted by violence and oppression, past and present. And it's time for us white folks to face up to it. Here's what I mean. Sociologist Avery Gordon, and I don't know, you know Avery, she's right there at UC Santa Barbara. I don't know whether you studied with her at all, but about 20 years ago, she wrote a really important book called Ghostly Matters. And she asserts this: haunting, she says, is a constituent element of modern social life through which, and pay attention to these words, through which repressed or unsolved social violence makes itself known in everyday life, especially when these things are supposedly over and done with, such as slavery, or when their oppressive nature is continuously denied. So just sit with that for a moment. She's saying that an essential part of our social fabric in America is haunted because of things that supposedly belong to the past. So I want to suggest that haunting accounts for the incredible energy behind what we've been experiencing in the widespread protests that have followed in the wake of the police murder of George Floyd just over 1 month ago. There's a history hovering over these issues of justice for Black bodies in our predominantly white body politic. This legacy of American apartheid continues in current disparities in both healthcare and economic opportunity for people of color that have been revealed through the current COVID crisis. This is why a couple of weeks ago, Pastor Raphael Warnock of Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is the pulpit where Martin Luther King Jr. served back in the day, Warnock called the current pandemic a double virus, what he calls COVID-19 and 1619, referring obviously to the disease of racism that landed on the shores of America with the first slave ship 401 years ago. Justice is the only vaccine that can combat the double virus of COVID and racism in our country. So the relentless knee on the neck of Black bodies in this country taps into these ghosts. And eventually folk respond by rising up, or, as is the case with so many of us white folks, try to flee from the ghosts by denying that there is a systemic problem or that it has anything to do with our history. Exhibit number 1 for haunting in Southern California. Last month was not the first time we've seen Los Angeles burn because of the rage against police violence. You know, the famous "No Justice, No Peace" slogan actually was coined 28 years ago during the 1992 rebellion. On March 3rd, 1991, Rodney King, African-American motorist, was pulled over by LA cops after leading them on a high-speed chase. Once pulled out of the car and put on the ground, King was beaten mercilessly by 4 officers. A bystander, George Holliday, famously videotaped much of the incident from a distance. Then on April 29th, 1992, a jury in Simi Valley, composed of 10 white folks, 1 Hispanic and 1 Asian, after 7 days of testimony, acquitted 3 of the officers, the 4th one being on a hung charge. I know David remembers this moment because he alludes to it in his letter to the paper. And I certainly remember the moment when the verdict came in. I was working as a community organizer in East Los Angeles. And this is a famous photo of the Venerable Reverend Cecil Murray of First AME Church in LA watching the verdict come in. And he could just see the storm coming. And so could I. The room was silent. And then people just went crazy and kind of got it out of our systems and then went to work, because within moments, the storm broke over Los Angeles. Within hours, riots and looting went off around the county and spread to other cities around the country. Over the course of 3 days, 53 people died, 2,000 folks were injured. Estimates of material losses were around the $1 billion range. It was the largest urban uprising in US history. And of course, Rodney King's famous query to America, "Can we all get along?" became part of the haunting. And yet those fires, they weren't the first time either for Los Angeles. No, the ghosts were deeper still. Watts' 1965 was the first time, again sparked by a routine traffic stop of a Black man by white cops and a beating and the boiling over of frustration. It was one of a string of summer urban riots throughout the decade because of racial and economic injustice. But Watts became the national symbol for Black rage. It reminded Americans, if only for a moment, of the inevitable violence that sooner or later would erupt when and wherever justice is lacking. I was only 10 living in Pasadena, but I can still remember the smell of the burning in my nostrils. Watts' rebellion was mostly contained to the difference in 1992 as it spread throughout the entire city, but it too was a major uprising. Federal troops were called into the city to occupy Los Angeles. So the die was cast for history to keep repeating itself. So the question before us in our time now, more than 50 years later, is how deep do we want to explore these ghosts? A few days after the Watts uprising 55 years ago, Dr. King came to town. He was deeply moved by the conversations he had with folks on the street, and his experience figured into his most prophetic speech given less than 2 years later in New York, his time to break the silence sermon, in which he properly recognized that disenfranchised inner city youth who were rioting were only mirroring the violent behavior they saw in their nation around the world, especially at that time in Vietnam. And in a later speech, just before he was assassinated, King famously said, a riot is the language of the unheard. And I would add that street protests are also the language of haunting. And so this haunting spreads, and it spreads across both time and space, even as far away as Syria. Hauntology, the study of haunting, has become a new social psychological field, which has animated significant studies by Indigenous and Black scholars who are seeking to understand how past trauma lingers in both people and places, in stories and histories, and also in perpetrators and their descendants. Those of us who are haunted by the violence sponsored by the social project from which we benefit. And as you know, this concerns not only Black men, it's also Black women, something highlighted in the ongoing Say Her Name movement, and extends to Indigenous communities, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls movement, which for years has been trying to hold the government accountable for the disproportionate rate of disappearances of Native females. So one Indigenous scholar, Eve Tuck, talks of the even longer haunted history of white supremacy's violence toward Indigenous people in North America. She writes pointedly, settler colonialism, the management of those who have been made killable, that's what she calls our system. Settler colonialism and haunting are inextricably bound. Each ensures that there are always more ghosts to return. And so they keep returning right up to the present. And this is what I want to emphasize. Until and unless we confront the hauntings and the history and the present iterations of that history, we will continue to live surrounded by ghosts. Indigenous lives matter too. Last weekend, for example, here in Ventura, we had protests around an effort to take down the statue of Father Junipero Serra, led by our friend Julie Tumamite, Chumash band leader here in this area. It was a protest to try to talk about genocide of the mission system that Father Serra forged during the Spanish colonization of California. And of course, last weekend, statues of Serra, in fact, were torn down in both Los Angeles and San Francisco. Well, with all that's going on in our work, we like how activist Adrienne Marie Brown puts it. Things aren't getting worse, they're getting uncovered. So we must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. Now, I love this for many reasons, not least of which she's using New Testament language here, right? To unveil comes from the Greek word apocalypsis or apocalyptic that we find in our scripture. It is in this sense that we are living in apocalyptic times. So taking Brown's cue, let us turn for a moment to another line from Avery Gordon where she talks about haunting is neither pre-modern superstition nor individual psychosis. It is a generalizable social phenomenon to which we should pay attention. To study social life, we have to confront its ghostly aspects. And haunting, sure enough, isn't captured by friendly ghost cartoons nor by Hollywood horror movies, all of which are engineered to entertain and distract us from the real ghosts in our self and society. So I believe that the social phenomenon of haunting is analogous to what the healer Jesus of Nazareth diagnosed and engaged as unclean spirits. The Gospels portray Rabbi Jesus as unmasking two kinds of spirits of oppression. On one hand, Jesus casts out what we might call political demons, as in the case in Mark 5 of the Legion. You know, the famous story where the pigs go over the cliff and all. These unclean spirits represent the external occupying powers who, in this case, have locked down a man among the dead in the militarily colonized region of Gerasa. The true name of this demon, of course, is revealed in this story as Legion, which for a first century Jewish peasant in Roman Palestine had only one meaning. The Legion was the face of Roman oppression. It was omnipresent on the landscape of the occupation. Now, the great philosopher physician Frantz Fanon studied exorcism and the social psychology of mental illness in situations of political repression during the Algerian rebellion against French colonialism in the 1950s. Fanon is very famous for books such as Black Masks, White Power, that kind of stuff, The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon argued that in traditional societies, demon possession is often a reflection of what he called class antagonism rooted in economic exploitation, or a socially acceptable form of oblique protest, veiled protest against or escape from social oppression. So think of that. Think of demon possession in a traditional society as itself a form of protest in one's body. So in this sense, we might say that the tortured body of Mark's Gerasene demoniac mirrored the violence of the body politic of militarily occupied Palestine. Very specifically, the 20th Legion was stationed in the unruly province of Palestine during Mark's time. And this later propaganda plaque found in northern England, which like Palestine was a periphery of the empire, tells a tale of military domination. At left is the god Mars, the god of war, brandishing a spear. And at right, the mythological hero Hercules holding his club. What is the message? It's, hey people, if you mess with us, we will beat you down. And don't forget to notice at the bottom of the plaque, it's a pig, because pigs were the mascot of the 20th Legion. So in Mark's story, when Jesus sends that demonic spirit into the company of pigs, which is then drowned into the sea, well, you're beholding ancient counter-propaganda. Those who have been possessed and occupied by the system of Legion remember the old sacred story in which the imperial army of Pharaoh is drowned in the sea. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. What is that? It's a line from a slave spiritual from 19th century white supremacist America, singing about a first century Palestinian woman, Mary, about a liberation movement 1,000 years before that. That, folks, is haunting. Now, the other kind of exorcism we see in Jesus' ministry focuses more on the internal suppression of marginalized people. We see an example of this in the case of a silencing spirit that renders someone unable to speak or hear in Luke chapter 11. And that's the text I wish to engage a little here. It is important to recognize that this Lucan sequence comes right on the heels of the Lord's Prayer, that mini catechism in radical discipleship. Jesus understands that our social imaginations are locked down by empire. And so in Luke 11, not only teaches us in the disciples' prayer, but he liberates us to speak it. Because as one anthropologist notes, a central element of haunting is secrecy, where the secret may be shameful, not speakable. You see, that's the demon that most white folk are possessed by, the demon of silence. And because we are silenced, we silence others. But Jesus heals us to break our silence, to say their names. In biblical stories, the personal and political are deeply intertwined. So in the aftermath of this exorcism, we see how Jesus' liberating action is immediately criminalized by the local authorities. His opponents quickly resort to name calling, conjuring up the archetypal enemy Beelzebul. In our contemporary context, it would be like them calling him a communist or a terrorist or an outside agitator. You get the idea. Not much has changed in the culture wars from then until today. Jesus then turns around and interrogates their attempt to demonize him, pointing out the absurdity of Satan casting out Satan. No, he says, open your eyes and realize that the liberation I bring is nothing less than the sovereignty of God reasserting itself in your midst. But he's not done. He then proceeds to spin a parable, one that fully politicizes what is at stake. He compares his liberating ministry to laying siege to the strong man's hegemony over human hearts and minds. And he calls for people to join him in an insurgency against empire around us and within us. Some of you know that this strongman parable has been very important to my own reading of the Gospels. It is an extraordinarily militant way in which Jesus portrays his ministry, which ministry is to animate people to find their voices, to overcome disembowelment and dispossession, and to proclaim that their lives matter. The finger of God unsilences, because this is the only way that hauntings can be healed. It's the only way that hauntings can be healed, friends, is by unsilencing the oppression, the repression, the suppression. But no sooner does Jesus invoke his mission of defiance of the principalities and powers who dumb down and disappear and dehumanize people, then he immediately turns back to the internal, in arguably the strangest parable in the entire New Testament. And yet I believe this speaks poignantly to the complex healing required by the journey of healing a haunted self and a haunted society. He speaks about an unclean spirit that once it goes out of a person wanders through the desert looking for a resting place, but not finding any, returns to the home from which it comes. Finding it swept and put in order, it goes and brings 7 other spirits more evil than itself. And they all enter and live there. And the last state is worse than the first. Now, I know that this is pretty weird stuff to our modern ears, but in traditional societies, not so much. This parable is working with the archetypal number 7, which resonates across a wide range of religious and mystical traditions. But in our work, we think of the parable as trying to get disciples to journey deeper into the layers of our captivity and our conformity, to pursue a kind of archaeology of our haunting. Jesus is actually inverting the Jewish symbol of liberation, 7 equals Sabbath, in order to warn us that the struggle for freedom will be much more difficult and protracted than we imagine. It's not going to happen with easy statements or imagined reconciliation, because Jesus knows that resistance to the work of liberation within us and around us will crack back. It'll come back 7 times stronger. The forces of conformity and control will say, just try to take 1 step forward. We'll knock you 7 steps back. Jesus is offering here an important reality check, and it surely resonates with the experience of anyone who has ever tried to free themselves from personal addiction, or to free their community from political oppression, or both. So we prefer the metaphor of peeling the proverbial onion of self and society, 7 layers down, with all the accompanying tears. The hauntings, friends, go that deep in our individual and collective spirits, in our bodies, and in our body politic. This is hard work, says Jesus. But here's the good news for us confused and contradiction-ridden Christians, especially white Christians. The Gospels attest that the central to the vocation of Jesus was his work as a healer. But he was not a socializing physician. That is, he didn't patch people up so that they could carry on with the status quo. Listen up, white churches. Jesus does not heal us to carry on with the status quo. No, he understands that the real disease goes deeper. He is a radical doctor who seeks the roots of our dis-ease. And there's only one requirement, and that is that we admit to ourselves and to each other that we are sick. Racism is not somebody else's problem to fix. And this isn't about somebody else's marginalization, which would-be white saviors need to rectify. As Wendell Berry wrote 50 years ago, it is our hidden wound in white America. And Jesus offers us strong medicine to treat the external oppression and internal psychosis of white supremacy, to deal with our haunted histories. This is why Jesus' healings were always disruptive of the status quo, often earning him the ire of the authorities, as we just saw. He was, after all, surrounded by regular folks who didn't understand they weren't healthy, and by people in power who insisted that there were no fatal flaws in their social, political, religious system. But the cure, according to this text in Luke 5, is the process of repentance. That is, that you and I join in the struggle to turn our pathological and haunted personal and political history around. It's kind of like a 12-step program. Because as you know, the meaning of the Greek term metanoia is to change directions as a lifelong commitment. Unfortunately, the word repentance has become utterly domesticated and privatized and spiritualized in Christian circles today. Well, we all know how powerful medicine can be mishandled, like in the opioid crisis today. In the words of our gospel parable, too often in church history, 1 unclean spirit was shown the door of the church, while 7 more rested comfortably in the pews. Our faith communities must become places where we nurture the courage to go deep in our personal and political disciplines of peeling the onion 7 layers down. Part of this will involve learning to feel and share our pain about our complicity, our entanglement in racism, something that your pastor so eloquently shouted out to Santa Barbara a couple of weeks ago. An entanglement that is in the past and in the present and within us and around us. The emotional labor of people of color of being the ones always having to share their pain so we white folks can get it, it's too costly. In the long run, our work cannot be sustained on other people's pain, nor on other people's strength. This is our onion to peel. But if we do, and we can do it, we can embrace the prophetic hope intoned by Malachi, that a day is coming when Creator will burn the works of injustice to its roots and heal all the hauntings until the sun of righteousness and justice rises with healing in its wings. Amen.